All right, this is a sound check. Today is January the 31st, 2022. I'm presenting in the series of on the lectures of evil, lecture number 5, the Hebrew Bible, human rivalry. All right, this is a sound check. With God. Today is January the 31st, 20. Excellent. It looks like we've got some sound. And I'd like to wish you all a warm welcome. Welcome to the channel. Welcome to the show. Please like, subscribe, and share everywhere. I'd like to get the message out that crushing Christianity is my main aim. And every single day of my life is committed to this purpose. I have been presenting a series of lectures on evil by Dr. Charles Mathewes from the University of Virginia. Today is lecture number 5, and there's no reason I can think of whatsoever to delay the lecture. So let's get into it. And it'll take about 30 minutes. We'll see you then. After the 30 minutes is done, we have an open room if you guys want to join. Other than that, we will see you in episode number 6. Enjoy.
Welcome back. We're turning back now from Greece to the ancient Near East, but now to the scriptures of the people Israel. In the early episodes from the book of Genesis, we see a vision of evil fully on display. One that suggests evil is fundamentally a form of rebellion against a single, good, sovereign God. The origins of evil here, in this account, are intertwined with a particular kind of human ambition, which is really first named here, and that is a human ambition to rival God. Evil in this tradition thus has an ineliminably theological dimension, much like I said with Plato, prompted, though, by psychological motivations of resentment and rivalry. And God here, in this account, seems both a guard against evil for humans and also, indirectly, inadvertently, a goad towards it. Now, before we begin by looking at Genesis, a side note is really in order. As I suggested when we were talking about the Enuma Elish, we by and large have a habit of thinking that the Bible was written in almost complete isolation from the rest of the world and from the rest of history, as if it were written, as it were, in a vacuum. Clearly now we can tell from the Enuma Elish that that is not so, and it helps us to know what the Bible, what any biblical text, is saying no to in order to understand what it is affirming. But it's not just that the books of the Bible came out of a world already filled, swarming with stories from other cultures. That world also had physical remains, ruins of long abandoned cities from earlier cultures. Consider this. The earliest known written records that we have in human history go back to about 3000 BCE or so. But in fact, civilization was already about 2000 or more years old then, as long ago, that is, as the Roman Empire and the first Christians are to us today. The people of that time, 3000 BCE, already lived amidst rubble and beside ruins. Theirs was already an old world. So people came to written self-awareness in mythology already with a deep past. The human has always had an historical self-consciousness about coming late in the world. Humans have always come late in their history. This is important for this lecture Because one of the ways we keep these texts at a safe distance from ourselves is by imagining that they were written down by people at a time of unimaginable strangeness compared to our own, unimaginably distant from ours. Somehow, these texts seem to us completely alien in some way, unaffiliated with the history we inhabit. But if we believe that, we insulate ourselves from the possibility that these texts were written down by people like us and have something directly to say to us about our common human condition. And I think they do. Let's see what that is. Let's look first at the story of Adam and Eve, a story of rebellion and perfection, but not perhaps the story that many people think they know. Recall, first of all, the Enuma Elish here for a second. The story of Adam and Eve follows a recounting of the creation, which seems resolutely, though again silently, to set its face against the combat myth paradigm of the ancient Near East. In the Enuma Elish, remember, there was a cosmic struggle. Forces of order, forces of chaos. Finally, the forces of order win, but they used the forces of chaos as a basis on which to build the cosmos. Order and chaos, good and evil, coexist in a world that no one is really in charge of. But in Genesis, this is not the case. In Genesis, there's no struggle. God commands, and it is done. Yes, there are traces of this earlier story. Right? We saw the face of God moves across the waters of the deep, tehom in ancient Hebrew, which is again lexically related to Tiamat, the Sumerian chaos goddess, the one killed by Marduk, the one whose the world was made out of her corpse. But the traces in Genesis of the earlier myth really serve only to reinforce the distance between this vision of the world and that of the combat myth. Here, the world is wholly good and seen as such and governed as such by a wholly good God. But we have to be careful. The story of Genesis, as it would have been read by the ancient Israelites who first put it on paper, is in very fundamental ways not the story most people today read, especially Christians, when they read the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis. We read the story today as the story that St. Paul tells, in fact, in his New Testament letters of Adam and Eve and of Genesis, the larger story, or at least what later readers took to be Paul's story. Here, Satan, in the guise of a serpent, creates all evil in the world in a context in which God creates a totally good, totally ordered cosmos out of nothing. Adam and Eve are not just the first people to fall in the world. They, in some sense, inaugurate the history of evil itself. Now, this is a Christian, indeed, a very Christologically informed reading of the Genesis text. That is, a reading that is profoundly informed by another experience of Jesus Christ, which has shaped Christian accounts. But we don't want to go that way. We want to look at the text in a more archaeological sense, in terms of how it was most likely to have been read by its earliest audience. Just as an example of that, almost all of us assume that the fruit in the Garden of Eden, of course, is what? Is it a pomegranate? No, it's an apple. But in fact, the story of the apple as the fruit in the Garden of Eden is actually a late medieval version of the story. In the Genesis account itself, it only says fruit. Now, in this reading of the story, how people at the time it was written down would have understood it, the fall does not represent the entry of evil into the world in a wholly unanticipated way. Instead, the fall is more representative than constitutive of the reality of evil in the world. Adam and Eve do not create evil out of nothing, as Christians believe God created the cosmos. Rather, they are the first to actualize the potential for evil, which was part of the cosmic structure that God had created from the beginning. Theirs is only, as it were, the first falling, not the origin of all fault in the cosmos. Despite the overall resistance of the text to the Babylonian combat myth, all these ancient Near Eastern stories, the Genesis account still suggests that evil and temptation were a potential presence in the world, and one bound to have some impact in the history of the world. Also, just as an aside on this story, what exactly is the nature of Eve's temptation? Right? The language that we get of Eve seeing that the fruit was good to eat, which recalls, by the way, God's seeing of creation as good, suggests a perverted vision, a parody of God's seeing that the world is good. Something deep is being said here about temptation. Eve's temptation here is in some ways a temptation to behave as God does, the temptation to judge for herself, a temptation that is to theological sovereignty, right? As the serpent says, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And this raises another question. When exactly does sin begin? Where exactly is the moment of sin? Where does the fall start? Where's the first step off the precipice? With the act of eating the apple? With the seeing of it as good to eat? With the serpent's question? With Eve's first answer to the serpent? This is enormously rich for the later theological traditions that comment on these texts, Jewish and Christian alike, because it bears importantly on what exactly is the sin. Is it an external act? Is it the experience of temptation? Is it the sheer disobedience of the will that prompts the act? Is it the simple eating of the fruit, as if there were some poison in it, right? As in Snow White's apple in the story of Snow White. And why, after all, why is the tree there in the garden at all? What was God thinking? And why is it that the knowledge of good and evil is the crucial thing here? What is it about the knowledge that's so destructive for humans? This knowledge appears 4 times in the story, and it seems to mean a kind of knowledge that encompasses all things, not just the meaning of these 2 terms, good and evil, but more like from alpha to omega, from soup to nuts. And yet, the term still seems loaded with a meaning that is both ominous and opaque. Why is it the knowledge of good and evil that is the problem? And of all the forms of knowledge that could cause a fall from happiness, why would it be the knowledge of good and evil? One clue here may be in the term knowing that is used. The Hebrew root of this word is yada. This is not simply an abstract conceptual knowledge, not knowing math or knowing how to drive a car, really. Well, maybe a little bit more like knowing how to drive a car. But the knowing in this sense is the same word that is used in the Bible with a sexual connotation. It designates an intimate experience, more than a merely intellectual acquaintance. Such knowledge gives its knower a certain set of skills and a certain kind of maturity, perhaps. But the Bible suggests it is a flawed maturity. This knowledge is both accomplishment and burden, blessing and curse, but mostly curse. Perhaps the story of Adam and Eve is telling us, perhaps all such human maturity is accidental and reluctant. Perhaps any real wisdom contains within itself a certain ambivalence about the cost incurred to gain that wisdom. Very few are the 20-year-olds who want to be 80. But very many 80-year-olds are at least sometimes interested in being 20 again. innocence doesn't look so bad from the side of experience. Now, the nature of evil here is interesting. It's clearly a form of rebellion, a kind of rivalry against God, right? To be like God. Perhaps initially inadvertent, but then it compounds itself in Adam and Eve's flight and hiding from God. There's a longing for rivalry with God, but at no point are humans actually able to rival God. There's a fundamentally futile character to evil and rebellion in this story that the combat myth never contains. There's another thing about this story which is really interesting to think about. Adam took the fruit as well, in a way as an act of solidarity with Eve. There's a weird community suggested to evil here. Once they have both eaten of the fruit, then their eyes were open and they worked together. Evil, that is not simply an individual act. It is compounded and enriched and deepened by the communality that comes with evil as well. We'll see this in a minute when we look at the Tower of Babel as well. Now, once this evasion has happened, and God begins to list the kinds of punishments that will ensue because of it, this litany of maledictions seems endless. Effort, pain, labor, enmity in nature. The litany is endless, in fact, and this is, ironically perhaps, truly the real fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Adam and Eve, and that's how you say it, Adam. We can say Adam, but Adam and Eve are exiled from Eden as a consequence of their sins. The gates of paradise are closed to them and to all who follow them. All of us now live, as it were, east of Eden. Now, interestingly, there's a long-standing controversy in Christian theology. We won't get into it here, but I just want to mention it to you, as to whether redemption is a matter of our sheer restoration to the Edenic state, or is it a matter of something even greater, an elevation in Jesus Christ to a new status. For Christians, that is, the relationship between Adam and Christ, who is sometimes called the second Adam or the new Adam, is complicated. Is redemption a return to innocence, or is it something else, a greater wisdom acquired through the loss of innocence, but movement into another kind of mature moral state? In any way, I want to mention that only to say that that's a topic for another lecture series. Turning from the fall now to Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's children, we see the pattern of rebellion continue. But this time the rebellion begins to have direct interhuman implications, not simply implications for the divine-human interaction. The basic story here is simple. The surprising choice of one brother over another by God in their mutual offerings to God of sacrifices provokes wrath in the passed-over brother. And this wrath leads the passed-over brother, that is Cain, to murder, so that Cain kills Abel, whose blood then cries from the ground to God. And God discovers Cain's crime and exiles him, making him what the scriptures call a restless wanderer over the face of the earth, leading to any number of pretty good country western songs. This is, in some ways, a story about the dangers of resentment. As God says to Cain in their exchange about where Abel is, right? If you do well, you can hold up your head. But if not, sin is crouching at your door. It seeks to master you, but you must master it. It's a very, very famous text. Begins to be very important for all later Jewish ethics, and especially rabbinic ethics as well. Now, the danger of resentment here as a motivator is quite clear. It warps our vision of what is important and in fact comes to master us. Ironically, this is visible in Cain's very reply to God when God asks him where Abel is. Cain says famously, "Am I my brother's keeper?" What you might not have realized, though, right, is that Abel as a shepherd and Cain as a farmer, Abel is the one who's a keeper. The word keeper is also the word for shepherd here. Cain is saying, I'm a farmer, I'm not a shepherd. I shouldn't care about my brother's place, right? So there's a very interesting kind of angry retort to God there. It's not just a naive question on Cain's part. The lesson here, and we'll see this taken up in later lectures as well, is that sin is now, east of Eden, perpetually part of our lives. And humans are engaged in a grim twilight struggle against it. And much of the time, we will fail. Cain gives into his sin and suffers the consequences. The story of the rival brothers is repeated perpetually throughout the Bible, as the mysterious election of some by God over others leads the non-elected others repeatedly to envy and to do violence to the elect. But God repeatedly also turns the evil against itself and creates good. You can even see this in the Christian New Testament. Paul plays on this when he talks about the surprising way that Jesus is the cunning Messiah who has won through dying. There's always a matter of sibling rivalry. Jesus sets himself up against the temple authorities, and thus, in a way, turns out for Paul to be the younger brother who is favored by God. Now, eventually, Cain's wandering comes to a sort of an end. And he settles down and he founds a city. In fact, he founds the first city in history, at least as people read the Bible. And think about that. The first murderer is also the first founder of a city. I think we'll look at later, St. Augustine makes a lot of hay about this because he compares Cain and Abel to Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. Well, Romulus founds Rome and he kills Remus in the same time. Because of this connection between cities and sin, even here in Genesis, we're going to turn to cities as sites of rebellion against God now. And the classic case of this, of course, is the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel exemplifies rebellion in an explicitly political way. Remember the logic of the decision to build the tower. This is in the 11th chapter of Genesis. The people say, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach to heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Here, rebellion against God is now overt and collaborative. This is political rebellion. Humans are now working together in concert, which in itself is a good thing, right? They're singing, "We are the world" or something. But we are the world against God. And God's response to this, of course, is to render the world fractured among many different languages, many different people. There's a deep thought here about sin and politics, and a profound suspicion that begins to emerge here that carries forward even to today. The problematic unity of all mankind against God, the idea that all of humanity could be joined together in a rivalry with God, is explicitly named as a danger by God. Right? God sees what they're doing and he says, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do." God fears the community of humans when it is separate from the right worship of God and from obedience to God, precisely because it is so powerful. Human communities, human peoples working in community, turn out to be an exceptionally problematic thing in the early books of the Hebrew Bible. Interesting, there's no report of the tower's toppling in the text. The suggestion is that the people simply stopped working on it and walked away. This made for an especially vivid moment in the Bible, because as I said at the beginning of this lecture, by the time this text is written, civilization in the ancient Near East is already millennia old. And so the ruin of the tower might have been something that one would have expected to see somewhere out there on the far horizon as you were herding your sheep somewhere on the plain of Shinar, somewhere like that. Also, calling this tower Babel is not simply a matter of referring to Babylon, right? It refers also to Babel, to a language of chaos and incoherence. It suggests that the fracture of humans into multiple languages and cultures is itself a sign of the human decline, right? So that in two different ways, two large-scale memories come out of this story. On the one hand, the idea that humans working together is something that is feared by God unless they are working under God's control. On the other, the idea that the plurality of cultures and languages in the world, our multitudinousness in this world, is itself a further sign of sin. But of course, the fundamental point here is that Babel is also a place where many peoples try to live, if not together, at least in proximity to one another. This is one of the first moments when vast cosmopolitan human political organizations, right, the sorts of thing we call empires, begin to be associated in the Jewish and then Christian traditions in a particular way with human depravity and corruption. We'll see this again when we get to the Christian New Testament in the book of Revelation. There's a complicated ambivalence and possibly hostility to large-scale human endeavors. A certain kind of concern about cities and empires emerges here. And so when people talk about, say, a big city like New York as a Babylon, there's actually a deep theological resonance that goes way back in the tradition, echoing this. Well, the set of stories that we've looked at in these texts, they share some common traits. They suggest that evil is real and palpable and works sometimes to divide humans, sometimes to bring them together, sometimes to set them at odds and with blades against one another, but always to set them up in rivalry with God. This is crucial. Evil in these accounts has an inescapably theological dimension, a dimension of rebellion, whether of a broken relationship, such as a violation of the covenant, we'll talk about the covenant in the next lecture, or a rupture of the harmony that is the natural order, or the formation of a human community, an empire, to rival God's rule. And part of the consequence, the punishment for evil, is precisely God's retribution for that rebellion. Now, by thinking of it as rebellion, it immediately means that God is, in an important way, innocent of evil. For after all, God can't be held responsible for those who go against God. In other words, God cannot be the kind of person who creates a world and sets up creatures who will, in some important way, revolt against that God. So unlike, say, the ancient Near East stories, where you have the role of human community as revolting against God only because some other gods support it, or against the Greek tragedians, where you have an account where the gods seem in some complicated way to undergird multiple patterns of theological and political revolt against the deities and also against human order. In the Hebrew Bible, what we see is a relatively coherent picture of a God whose plans for humanity are straightforward and easy to manage, and yet those plans are, in some completely inexplicable and curious way, rejected by humans entirely. That might be the core curiosity of this tradition. Because this tradition, in a certain way, secures the goodness and sovereignty of God and the goodness and the stability of the moral order as a whole, but only at the cost, and at a large cost, of rendering the root motive of human evil in some important way thoroughly mysterious. Why is it that when Eve looks at the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she sees that it is good to eat? Why does she want that? That's a question that thinkers, theologians, priests, rabbis have wondered about for 3,000 years. Why, when you had everything in the world, would you want more? But there is another tradition, a rival story in the Bible, alongside this original story, that seems to suggest that God is not holy, or at least not in any simple way, simply good. That God has a murkier and altogether more sinister dimension. And we will turn to that dimension, that rival story, next.
Well, I found that rather interesting, actually. Thank you for watching. My name is Sidney Winston. I am a humanist, an atheist, a Zionist, the three seculars. All gods are imaginary. Prove me wrong. Please like, subscribe, and share, and subscribe, and and support my channel. Or alternatively, you can just dislike the this episode or any of them. I will be back with part number 6 at this point. I believe it's the Christian view of evil. So I'll be back real soon. I'll throw the time up on the screen when I'm good and ready, but it won't be very long. And you can get to watch the next lecture if you like. I would really appreciate any comments or interaction in the live chat while it's while we are streaming. Thank you again. See you next time.